On today's episode of 7 Minute Expert, I sit down with Reverend Johnnie Moore, an internationally recognized evangelical leader who has been working to help persecuted people across the world. We discuss his work and how you can get involved. If you like the episode, please make sure to like and subscribe. I'm Gideon Askowitz, and this is 7 Minute Expert. Reverend Johnnie Moore, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. We're so happy to have you on 7 Minute Expert. What we're going to do today is hopefully discuss a little bit about your work fighting for religious liberty across the entire world and how you got started in both the Trump and Biden administrations, your work with the Fellowship for Christians and Jews, and what you are looking forward to in terms of the next policy goals. Specifically, I want to talk to you and hear your opinions about how Americans of all religions can help Christians who are being persecuted in the Congo and in the Middle East, which is currently a very serious issue. And without further ado, could you just tell us a little bit about how you got your start in politics?
First of all, I don't like politics very much, but I really love people, and politics is at the heart of politics is public policy, and public policy affects people. And so if you care about people, especially in a democracy where the people make the decisions, you just have to be involved in politics, like whether you like it or whether you don't like it. And also you can be involved in politics on your terms. So you don't have to play the dirty tricks, that we're known for in American democracy or in other democracies. You can just be who you are, represent what you believe. You can choose to, compromise in Washington D.C. is sometimes like an expletive, but actually getting along with people to solve problems is what compromise is about. And so there's some things you can compromise on, some things you can't compromise on, and politicians sometimes don't know the difference, but like regular people that are involved in a public square can know the difference between something that's a principle versus something that's a point of negotiation. And so I reluctantly got engaged in the public square, but I feel like I have to because I have 3 kids. I really love America. I care about the world that we live in. I want to hand a better world to my children. So I just have no option. I have to be involved, but I can be involved on my terms, not the terms of other people.
So how do you go about doing that? I actually, I've had quite a number of experiences just based on what you're saying in terms of having to realize that the world of politics is quite dirty and not necessarily something that everybody should be involved in terms of like the way it operates. But if you're able to do it on your own terms and in a God-driven path, that's something that's really powerful and important. So how have you stuck to your mission, and what is your mission?
Yeah, well, I have like several rules, and one of those rules is you don't understand what you believe until you understand why people disagree with you. And so it's not just enough to understand your point of view on things. You have to really have to seek out different points of view, and in that sense you remain open-minded because sometimes you do change your mind on things. But as a person of faith, the foundation of that is my faith. Like I find my inspiration for what I try to do in the world. I find my guidance for what I try to do in the world in my faith. And actually, I think as a Christian, I read a lot of books written by Jewish scholars on what we call the Old Testament. Jews call the Hebrew Bible. It's the Hebrew Bible. That's what it is. Okay. It's written in Hebrew. And there's so many observations, I think. Yeah, right behind you. I see. Right. There's so many observations in the Hebrew Bible about politics. I mean, these are people that were living in complex periods of time. There's all kinds of interesting things happening between leaders and power and decision making in complex situations. And so for me, the Bible is really a source, a foundation for my engagement, in the public square. I also am looking for opportunities to work together with people to solve common problems. I'm not looking for excuses to avoid people. And so that means as a Christian that I'm working across like religious lines, sometimes across political lines. I want to solve the problems. I don't want to just win. Okay. And I think, Rabbi Sachs, who I love, he's one of my favorite authors. He says, and I'll reference him in the present tense, even though he's no longer with us, but Rabbi Sachs says that there are 2 ways of arguing. There's one way of arguing is to win. And there's another way of arguing, which is to find the truth. And if you argue to win, everyone loses, because if you're arguing to win and you just win, by winning you're diminishing the person you're arguing with. But if you argue to find the truth, then everyone wins, because no one loses when we find the truth. And I think that's also the approach I like to take to the complex issues, that we're, because politics is about problem solving. We wouldn't have problems if things weren't broken, and sometimes these are very, very knotty, complicated problems. And so, I'll quote another Jewish text that was quoted to me by a friend of mine when I wanted to quit, when I was just done with all this stuff, and a good friend of mine who I talk to every couple of days. He quoted Ethics of Our Fathers, where he said, it's not up to you to complete the task, but neither are you free to desist from it. And uh, I can have a tendency to feel like my responsibility is to solve the problem rather than to just achieve something in the process to solving it. And, I find a lot of inspiration. Like, it's not up to me to finish it, but I sure as anything am not free to avoid it. And to also quote Ethics of Our Fathers, it's a powerful verse there about, where there are no leaders, you have to be a leader. And I think we're in a time where there are no leaders. I mean, in so many different places. But the beauty of being in a democracy is not only can you be a leader, you can be a leader with power, and that power can be used for good, not for evil.
So what are some of those problems that you're working on? Be they in the political sphere or in the religious sphere, or both?
I mean, I care a lot about peace in the Middle East. Clearly, I'm not succeeding. None of us are succeeding. But
It's a complicated issue.
it's a complicated issue for generations. But actually, I'm optimistic. I mean, we saw the Abraham Accords on October 7th. I was actually on my way to Israel that night. I had a ticket booked. I was heading to Israel that evening. I was flying to Israel, and then on Thursday that week, I was flying to Saudi Arabia. You know, the fundamentals haven't changed in the region, to see a broader wave of peace move across the Middle East. But what we saw on October 7th, is we witnessed in our lifetime. Okay, we witnessed the single greatest massacre of the Jewish people since the Holocaust in our lifetime. And many times I've been to Israel, and I've been to Yad Vashem a number of times. And there's this garden at Yad Vashem for the righteous among the nations, like the non-Jews that helped Jews during the Holocaust. And I've often gone through this exercise in my head, and I think a lot of Christians go through this exercise when they walk through that garden, and they ask themselves, like, what would I have done had I been alive during the Holocaust? Because, I mean, the great horrifying fact that Christians have to recognize is that, a lot of the people in Germany that committed these atrocities were professing Christians. Okay, there were far fewer pastors that stood up for their Jewish neighbors than that just stood back, while this horror was happening. And I felt like on October 7th, like, this was a moment where all of us had to answer that question, not theoretically, but in our lifetime. What would we do? And so, I've dedicated myself the last year and a half to, advocating for the release of the hostages, and thank God, have had some success, in that, and standing up against this resurgent anti-Semitism around the world. Like, we cannot see this in our lifetime. And all of that's a natural connection, to my work over many, many years, helping persecuted people all over the world. I mean, I've been working on helping the Jewish community for a long time, but of course I'm a Christian, and I've given much of my adult life to helping persecuted Christians, all around the world. And so I don't know. I mean, it's, for me, I'm not trying to get involved in conversations about tariffs and trade, and it's not my area of expertise. Nobody's calling me for business advice. I don't even know how all these things work. But when it comes down to protecting human lives, whether they're Jewish lives or Christian lives, or innocent lives anywhere around the world, and standing up against evil and terrorism and injustice and all of these things, like, those are the issues I care about, and that's what I'm staying focused on.
That's I mean, I'm really thankful to hear a lot of what you're saying. It's powerful. I think it might interest you to know. I don't think it's just probably non-Jews who really contemplate when they go to Yad Vashem and you're standing in that garden, but you also have to ask yourself as a Jewish person. You're asking yourself, what would I have done had I not been Jewish and I was born in a different circumstance? How would I view that? And that's actually a lot of, I think, the driver of for this conversation in particular is I'm sitting in my apartment and I'm watching these videos on my phone. I see these Christians who are being really, like, I almost burst out in tears, just being slaughtered en masse, simply for their faith. And I realized that it is incumbent upon me also to try to learn how I could help and how I could connect members of the Jewish community to helping in that struggle. I don't think that it should only be Christians who are helping Jews when there's a slaughter of Jews. I think there should be Jews who are helping Christians. And I think that's important, not just in terms of it's the moral calling of God, but it's also the moral calling of God is also the foundation of the West and our way of life. Um, and I'm somebody I think I'm intending to dedicate myself to those causes. So how could if you had the opportunity to, and I know that you have a very large platform and this is a very small podcast, but how do you think Jewish Americans should think about how they could help and advocate for the Christian communities around the world who are being massacred for their faith, and how can we build a stronger coalition here at home?
Well, so many thoughts, but first of all, I want to thank you for your own concern, for our community. I mean, I often say, like, you don't believe in religious freedom at all unless you believe in religious freedom for all. And unfortunately, in so many parts of the world, like, the Christian community, they found those 70 Christians, uh, brutally massacred in that church in Congo. And I guarantee there are multiple other churches that this happened in. It's just in this um, terrible, terrible ransacking of Christian communities all across the Sahel and Western Africa. So much of it, like, we don't even know about, and that's what the terrorists and these other types of evil activities, they thrive in the shadows. It's the best thing we can do is shine as big a light on them as we possibly can. And I also think, as an evangelical Christian, like, there are 700 million evangelicals around the world. Like, the vast majority of evangelicals are taught, like I was as a kid, that we're to love our Jewish neighbors, that we're to support, the state of Israel. And I never met anyone who was Jewish until I was an adult. But I grew up in these small little, churches, Baptist churches in rural South Carolina, North Carolina, and it just, like, was taught to us. And all over the world, like, evangelicals, like, will stand up for the Jewish community. And, like, this is a miracle of history. I mean, most anti-Semitism in history has emanated from the Christian community, and yet
Yep.
in this amazing miracle of God, like, we have the fastest growing Christian community around the world now, the second largest Christian community around the world, and they're all Zionist. But by the way, you know, we have to move the relationship from being sentimental to being substantive, and we have to share in life together and know, one another's stories. And I think there's no better way for us to come together than for Christians and Jews to stand together against this injustice of persecution. When anybody, for their faith or who they are persecuted, God forbid, killed, like, we have to stand up for them. And there's a power in us standing together. And I also was really touched not long ago by a Jewish friend who came up to me and he said, "I want to thank you." And I said, "For what?" And he said, "Because the Bible came to the world through the Jews, but the Bible was proliferated around the world by the Christians."
Oh,
And I just want to thank you for your love for the Bible. And I think when people ask me why do evangelicals love the Jewish community, I always say it's for three reasons. Your book is our book. Your heroes are our heroes. We tell our children this story of Jewish heroes. And thirdly, while we interpret them differently, maybe misinterpret them plenty of times, your values are our values. And at the height of those values is our commitment to the dignity of every human being, to standing up against injustice, to speak up for the persecuted, to cherish life. And so I think, you know, but the single best thing we can do, in all of my experience all around the world talking to persecuted people, people with gunshot wounds in their sides, people who've had relatives killed in grotesque ways, and victims of ISIS, and victims of communists, and victims of all kinds of stuff. And they always say the same thing. They always say, please just tell the world our story. And that's like the best thing that we can do, if we tell the world the story of these people, and hopefully it'll awaken the conscience of the world.
I think that's absolutely right. And once we're awakening the conscious of the world, are there concrete? You were talking about substance before and alluding to that, and that's something that I've tried to focus on a lot in terms of my advocacy, in terms of moving from the shining light on the issues to then bridging that into actual policy goals. Are there particular results that you'd like to see, or that we could work towards, to help persecuted Christians and people of all faiths across the world?
Yeah, there's so many. I mean, first of all, the United States, should tie every foreign policy decision whatsoever to improving the conditions of these communities. Like, and it should be unrelenting. We have positions in the U.S. government that are unfilled, that actually focus on these issues. The ambassador at large for international religious freedom. There's a special advisor on the National Security Council dedicated to international religious freedom. There's an envoy to combat anti-Semitism. There's a deputy envoy to combat anti-Semitism. Rightly so, this new presidential administration is, getting all the very, very top positions in place, but they need to very, very quickly move to this second layer of positions. So there's somebody whose job every single day is to stand up, and speak for these people. I also think, like, those of us who travel a lot, either for business or for family or other reasons, like, take time to meet people, because, when I go meet the evangelical community in a city that I travel to, or a country that I travel to, it sends a message to that country. And I just think there's something very, very powerful about that. When it comes to the Jewish and Christian community, like, at the level of college, like, in the place of life that you're in, or that your peers are in, you know, we have like Jewish clubs like Hillel and Chabad and all this stuff on campuses. And we have Christian clubs, but they don't actually kind of know each other. And I think
True.
to find each other, to do things together. I had this experience um, at Vanderbilt University. I spoke at Vanderbilt, which is Vanderbilt president actually is probably done, or chancellor rather, has done probably the best job of any of the elite schools on handling all these like crazy issues. I'm a big fan of Chancellor Jeremiah, but I went to to the school to speak, and I was speaking in a simple class, not a big speech, a simple class, and half the people in the class were like Jewish, and half the people were evangelicals, and for whatever reason they came, because I was there, and many of them hadn't met one another. And it's like the best thing that can happen is like you guys become friends with each other and carry those friendships for the rest of your life. I mean, this is the type of work that we have to do. The U.S. government has all the leverage and all the power it needs to improve the conditions of persecuted people in virtually every country of the world if they prioritize it. But the people who run the U.S. government are regular people like you and I, who at different phases of their lives and career ended up in those positions. And the foremost supporter of Christian healthcare in Africa is a Jewish philanthropist.
I
And
did not know that.
his support of Christian healthcare in Africa is based upon two things. Number one, his college roommate was a Christian, and they're just lifelong friends. And number two, he discovered that the ROI on helping these Christian hospitals and clinics was just better. And so he's dedicated so much of his resources to like helping this cause. But it began as a friendship, early on. And so I think, from a policy perspective, there are all kinds of things the U.S. government, every diplomat should have this in their portfolio. Every conversation we have with a foreign country, get these positions appointed. We need to tie aid to these things. By the way, we need to hold the United Nations accountable. The U.S. government like funds the United Nations. There is no United Nations without the U.S. government. We host them in New York City. Like, we're the beating heart of the UN, and yet the main organizations in the United Nations that are dedicated to protecting persecuted people have been totally hijacked by anti-Semites and the persecutors of Christians included. Like, this is insane. and it has to stop. And it will stop tomorrow if Democrats and Republicans decide it has to stop. And I think these things are really important, and we can. So anyhow, Gideon, there are lots of things that can be done. The issue isn't that there are things that what is it that we need to do? It's people just doing them.
Got it. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you're saying that. I've encountered that a lot. That when we first went about trying to do some of our work in terms of the deporting foreign students who were endorsing terrorism, that was a big part of our policy platform. And we were told by a bunch of Senate teams, like, these are laws on the books. The administration is not enforcing them. And that really floored students. Like, what are you talking about? They're just not doing anything. And unfortunately, I'm sure that this is an issue across many different areas of government, that that administrations, both Republican and Democrat, don't necessarily take the actions that they're morally called upon to do, and that are in the best interest. Again, if we stand for the truth, then pursuing the truth is in our best interest inherently. Um, just before I let you go, I'm curious. They, as a member of the youth and of the religious community, um, obviously an Orthodox Jew, there are a lot of issues that I see in terms of people that I grew up with, in terms of falling off from faith. Do you find those issues in the Christian community, and how is your community working to combat those? Because I think fundamentally, and I'm assuming you probably agree, that if religion is at the center of our lives and is at the center really of our culture, then it's important that we make sure that that continues into the next generation.
Yeah, this is always a challenge. It's always been a challenge. As evangelicals, I'm like really, really proud of the survey. I forget who produced it. I have to go back and look, but there was a survey recently, like 6 weeks ago or something, that demonstrated that evangelicals, I think we had the best retention rate of like our next generation. And I sort of saw the survey with someone at the same time. It's like, why is that? I don't know. I don't know how they ask the questions, but my theory is just has a lot to do with religious education. Like, we go to church as evangelicals. Like, we don't have a pope, we don't have bishops. We have individual congregations, and they have Sunday schools or small groups, and our kids learn it. And it's one of the things I'm most envious about the Jewish community is, and I don't know, we have no reason as Christians for like getting rid of the Sabbath. It's in the 10 Commandments. I'm going to bring the Sabbath back to Christianity, but first I need to practice it, so I'm not a hypocrite. But one of
A lot of rules.
yeah, I know. One of the things I love about the rhythm of Jewish life is, if you have a Sabbath dinner or you practice the Sabbath, like you're educating and reinforcing, like, week in and week out, the story of the Jewish people and the prayers that you pray and like all of these things. And while we don't have something regimented like that, like, I think education is really the key. It's all about education. Like, it's not going to happen on accident. You can catch some of it in the environments that you're in. But the truth is that most religious communities that are declining, they decline for two reasons. They move away from their text or their practice,
We've
as
seen that happen. We've seen that
yeah, yeah,
happen in some communities.
and I think evangelicals and traditional religious communities, because of our connection to the text, like, we're hedged against that a little bit. And then secondly, it becomes like a social club, and there's more to that. Like, this is it really has to be integrated in our lives, and those that decline, they sort of like lose the educational piece of it. And so, I think one of the reasons why we fare better than a lot of other communities is our commitment to the text, and we take religious education seriously. Like, I have all these Bible verses, not, by the way, not like Jewish education, which I think is much better than ours in many ways, but like, I have all these Bible verses memorized. I didn't sit down with my Bible and just memorize the verses. I just got them because the churches I went to as a kid, I just heard them again and again. But I have like an idea, Gideon, that one day I'm going to do, and feel free to, everybody listening can steal the idea if they want, because we just need plenty of it. But I want Christians to start reading the same like weekly portion as the Jewish community.
That'd be awesome.
Scripture portion. And I'm going to produce like an annual book that's co-written by a Jew and a Christian. Could be a rabbi, could be a pastor, could be lay people, with like a reflection each week on that. So it has the weekly portion, and it has like a reflection. and it can be drawn mainly from the text, less the commentary, mainly the text, because of, Christians don't,
Theological differences.
yeah, there are theological differences there. But one of the things that really frustrated me when because I spent a lot of time studying the Bible with a Jewish rabbi a couple of years ago, almost every week. And I was just so sad that despite the fact that I have a seminary degree, like no one taught me Hebrew. And so there's so much in the text that we just miss as Christians because we don't read it as the Hebrew Bible. And so, yeah, I think education is the most important part of it. That education takes place best in the family unit subsidized by your congregation, your church, or your school. That's the secret. The good news on evangelicals, though, is like we have good signs everywhere. Suddenly, like more men are attending church than ever. We have the nuns, which are the unaffiliated, is now declining. It was going up every year for years. Now it's going down. We saw more Bibles sold last year than any previous year. The evangelical community is growing all over the world, and so that's good. But we can't take that for granted.
That's really wonderful. I'm so glad to hear it. It's funny, and I've begun to meet more religious Christians of different denominations, and I've actually been inspired by the amount of actual Bible verses that people know off the top of their head, and that you were quoting Ethics of Our Fathers is fascinating to me. Not I can't necessarily do that, but I study Talmud for 6-7 hours a day.
That's
So,
incredible. I'm totally jealous. Yeah,
um,
here I have a copy. Yeah, I keep it.
I have that copy too.
I don't read it enough, but I have it.
It's a good addition. My counselor gave it to me after a summer camp once. Good guy. He's a rabbi now.
By the way, that's something the Jewish community does. The Christian community should do. Like the culture of summer camps. We do summer camps.
Huge.
They're like a half a week or a week. Like these extended camp. I think it's a very powerful thing.
Yeah, it's very formative. I would definitely recommend it to anybody in the Christian community who's gonna watch this. I don't really want to take up any more of your time. I really appreciate you coming on. It's been really wonderful getting to speak to you and hear about your work in fighting the persecution of people of all faiths across the world. And I want to thank you for your work. I know that you've been publicly recognized by the Sam Wiesenthal Center for it and by other organizations. So thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate it. And love to stay in touch.
Thanks for having me, and stay in touch for sure. Anything I can do for you.
Of course. Reverend, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. If you like today's episode of 7 Minute Expert, please make sure to like and subscribe. I'm Gideon Askowitz, and this is 7 Minute Expert.